right, we are returning with our third speakers, and I'm so sorry that we had a quick break that time. Thank you guys for hanging in there with us. Our next speakers are Janet H. Anderson and Benjamin Dewar, and I'm going to read both of their bios for their presentation titled Fairness, Distortion, and Privilege: Ethical Challenges in Reporting Sexual Violence in Conflict. Janet H. Anderson is a journalist, editor, and educator. She trains and supports locally based journalists in covering atrocity crime trials and has authored several manuals guiding journalists and monitors in their work. She's the vice president of the Association of Journalists at the ICC. She also co-hosts Asymmetrical Haircuts, a podcast interviewing mainly female experts in international law. Benjamin Dewar is an international lawyer and expert in political communication. He worked for the government of the Netherlands and for the Nobel Peace Prize laureate Denis Mukwege and his foundation on conflict-related sexual violence. As an award-winning journalist, he reported extensively on conflict and justice issues from various countries around the world. This is Janet and Benjamin with Fairness, Distortion, and Privilege: Ethical Challenges in Reporting Sexual Violence in Conflict. Thank you, Janet and Benjamin.
Well, thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to be part of this interesting and important conference. So in this presentation, we will explore why certain groups are more visible than others in the media, and we'll focus specifically on sexual and gender-based crimes in conflict, because this is something we've been working on both as journalists in the field. So we've both been correspondents in the field, but have been working on policy and communications advice and trainings more recently. So this is a combination of our experience, mostly based on a presentation we've been giving in the past already, and based on a chapter that is coming out soon on the challenges journalists and media face when reporting on sexual and gender-based crimes in conflict. So I will discuss first these problems and challenges, and then in the second part, Janet will explain what we think could be done about it and what solutions could look like. So for many years, sexual and gender-based crimes have been neglected, victims have been ignored, and they have not been part of the discourse and have not been visible in the media as kind of invisible victims of war. This has changed in the last years, or perhaps 2 decades. There's been more attention from the media, from policymakers, also from the public, for sexual and gender-based crimes. And as a consequence of that media coverage, also the response of the international community has been different. There have been different resolutions in the UN system have been adopted. In the former Yugoslavia, for example, there has been circumstantial evidence that the increased coverage of rape and sexual violence in the war has even led to a decline in the incidence of rape. So there is a clear increasing awareness of the topic, and also an impact that this coverage has on the ground.
Hey, Benjamin, can I interrupt for a quick second?
Sure.
Do you want us to share your screen for the PowerPoint?
No, I'm going to share it in a second
Okay.
with the first slide.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So yeah, there is an increasing awareness and knowledge of the topic, but that's not enough, we think, and we noticed that sometimes the media are not not aim at telling the truth always, or the true stories, but rather focus on sensation. And this is where I would like to start with a few examples. So in headlines such as the first one, Amal Clooney spoke up for victims of sexual violence, or the second one, Angelina Jolie condemns sexual violence. It's problematic because there's a lot of focus in these cases on Amal Clooney or Angelina Jolie rather than on the victims themselves. And by focusing on these celebrities, the actual survivors become objects rather than subjects and agents being able to speaking for themselves. Now, why is that? First, I think they're easier to reach for journalists. So they have a spokesperson and they have media contacts. So they're just much more accessible. And second, and perhaps more importantly, readers and viewers can relate to them. They attract attention. They also function as a kind of a bridge between the readers, mostly in the West, and the crimes and the survivors in conflict or post-conflict zones. So the focus on celebrities can help to bridge that gap between these very different environments and experiences. There's something else we noticed, that without that bridge between the celebrities and the survivors, media tend to focus on the graphic details of the crimes. For example, with the Rohingya example, a soldier cut off her breasts as a headline, to really focus on these graphic incidents to attract attention. The Yazidi example, or the Yazidi experience, is also a case in point for that, where sexual slavery and rape featured very prominently in the international media, but where a majority of women have actually experienced these engagements or these interviews with the media as quite problematic. There was a study conducted with a few women in 2018, quite interesting, with women and girls that have been interviewed by international media. And in that study, the researchers looked at how survivors of sexual violence in Iraq experienced these interviews. And the research shows that in this case, really 80%, for example, expressed security concerns about questions journalists asked, for example, with regards to their location or who they are. So the fear of being identified, and as a consequence then security issues, or that 70% experience interviews as emotionally distressing, and sometimes even as re-traumatization, and 60%, still quite a high number, were disappointed because they have been given perhaps a wrong impression of what media can achieve and what an interview can achieve. Now, why is it that stories of survivors of sexual and gender-based crimes and conflict are either ignored or distorted? We argue that there are two factors. One are institutional factors, and the other one are more individual, personal factors. So with respect to the first one, the institutional factors, journalists face financial pressure, time pressure, which can lead to, in a way, easy solutions. Then they fall back on stereotypes, which is reflected then in their headlines or in their reporting. Also, there's a lot of competition, increasing competition with each other, which also means that headlines need to attract the attention of readers and viewers, and sensation is then an easy way to attract the attention. Domination of Western media is also something that contributes to a certain way of covering sexual violence and conflict, and as well as the focus on major events only, which means that hard news are considered more important than ongoing developments, and something that is not news, like sexual violence, because it unfortunately happens in many conflicts and is not a one-time event, therefore receives less attention. Another institutional factor is the representation of women within media organizations, both in the field and in the editorial positions. So, for example, war correspondents and editors are predominantly male, although that is also changing, but the way conflicts are covered is very often through a male lens, which means that topics that predominantly affect women receive less attention, or perhaps in a harmful way. Then there are a few individual factors. For example, the lack of awareness, a lack of ethical consciousness among individual journalists, and generally a lack of guidance during their education, but also from media outlets, which makes it more difficult for them if they're not aware of the consequences a certain way of covering or approaching survivors can have for their everyday life once an article or story has been published. Now, what can be done about it? Both the individual factors and the more structural institutional factors can be addressed, we think. And with that, I hand over to Janet, who will talk about potential solutions and ways to address these challenges.
Thanks, Benjamin. If you can keep screen sharing and go on to the next slide, please. Thank you. We looked from within our own experience at the ways that we see values being passed on the way that the ethics of our profession are being passed on. And we looked at 3 areas: ethics, training for entry into the profession, and the provision of new toolkits. On journalist ethics, these are traditionally the way that the journalism profession has managed itself for the last 100 years or so. They are particularly concerned with issues of press freedom and for methodology for people to judge the work of journalists from outside. They're particularly concerned with issues of independence and non-interference. And traditionally they say nothing on sexual or gender-based violence and how to report it. So that's an area that we think that would be useful for within our profession to look more clearly at. Next slide. Thank you. There's a deeper critique of these kinds of codes, particularly from a number of academics that we've read in this area, that one of the issues is that their very voluntary nature makes them difficult to uphold. There are relatively few sanctions for journalists who breach various ethical codes. They're also described by Stephen J. Ward as parochial, as things that actually don't serve journalism in its current form anymore because of the global nature of communication. And J.B. Singer has been arguing that journalism has been undergoing such rapid and complete change in the way that people are consuming and producing news and other information. Business models are changing so rapidly that these ethical codes have come under extreme strain, but also are practically ready to break and are no longer very useful. If we can move on to the next slide. Secondly, we looked at how people are being taught on how to report on sexual and gender-based violence and sexual and gender-based crimes, specifically as they come into the profession. And one example was from Australia by Louise North, saying that there are actually no programs that she could find within her within journalism being taught in Australia of addressing the portrayal of women in the media, as has been spoken by previous speakers, and how the news is produced generally, what the gendered aspects of that are. There's very little research into this, and we feel that an awful lot more needs to be done in order to examine why it is that the system is as it is. Can you move on to the next slide again, please? The third aspect of the ways that journalists learn, which is something that I'm particularly concerned with, is the provision of new toolkits and new training while people are in the jobs. And there are certainly a number of a range of opportunities there, a range of things that can be examined, which are suggesting how people should change the way that they're working. They provide a lot of very positive examples of reportage, how not to perpetuate issues of stigma, etc. They come from very significant areas, but they're very limited in their impact, and they don't address the main issues that are pervasive across the whole of our profession. So I'm going to hand back to Benjamin for our last point. Over to you, Benjamin.
You still have...
I'll move on. Just keep going for those, because we're running out of time.
Okay. Yeah, to conclude, change is possible. So a coverage or an ethical coverage of sexual and gender-based violence is possible, but change needs to happen on different levels. Individual journalists, and this is what we've been focusing on also in this presentation, need better training and more ethical guidance on reporting sexual and gender-based crimes, which increases awareness within the profession and leads to better better reporting practices. A fundamental shift is also necessary within the profession, within media outlets as a whole. Conflicts and wars need to be perceived in different ways. They should not be, or the focus should not only be on the fighting and what is going on the front lines, but also on the consequences and how war and conflict affect the different parts of the population, and the aspects that are generally not visible. So while the work of journalists has increased, the awareness for the problem of sexual and gender-based crimes, it's still important that this focus also within the media outlets and journalists, the journalistic profession, takes place, to not only report on the crimes, but report on an ethical and professional way. And with that, we'll happy to take your questions.
Thank you both so much for that interesting presentation. It looks like we've got a couple questions in the Q&A for you that I'll start with. Could you speak a bit about the differences, if any, in reporting sexual gender-based violence in conflict versus more domestic or daily occurrences?
Take that from my point of view is that the reporting of sexual and gender-based violence in conflict is seen as far more specialized. It's a relatively small number of people in our profession who deal with it in terms of the legal areas and understand accurately what is going on. When you're speaking about, take, I don't know, an example like working with journalists in Burundi, then they would be looking at it in the context of the conflict as a whole. That's what they would be reporting on. Whereas when they're reporting on what they would describe as gender-based violence inside their own society, they very much more relate it to domestic abuse, either male-female or female-male, either way.
Got it. Thank you, Janet. The next question, are there ways to tackle essentializing sexual and gender-based violence in conflict, men as the perpetrator versus women as victims, that are being taken?
I think that the problem with reporting sexual violence is, and that's not only the case in conflict zones, but also in the domestic context, is that we actually don't know the extent to which it's taking place and the extent to which it affects women and men. The focus so far has been on women as being the victim, and men as the perpetrators usually. Although there's also a change, and it's interesting that Matthew spoke about the kind of the new issue of female suicide bombers, and we notice also a shift certain increase of attention for male victims of sexual violence in conflict. But again, it's very hard to say the extent to which it takes place and whether that is reflected adequately in the media or in the level of coverage.
Right. Well, for the sake of time, it looks like we're going to go into our 5-minute break. We have one more question in the Q&A box for you guys, which we will post into the chat and have you answer there, if that's okay. And thank you both again for this great presentation. we will now begin the 5-minute break. Thank you.
Thank you.